What a pleasure it is to stand before you today, or this evening, here at NSCC. NSCC, for those of you who don't know, we are a community of approximately 8,000 students who really are here because we want to make a difference in the world. Our students not only make a difference in the local community, but they make a difference in the Commonwealth, as well as abroad. So we're really pleased to welcome you here, and I think it's such a honor for us at North Shore Community College to be able to have a program such as this here this afternoon. I'm Lloyd Holmes. I'm the Dean of Students here. Unfortunately, our President, Wayne Burden, could not join us this evening. He had other obligations, but he wanted to send his words of welcome to you. So I stand before you, and on behalf of President Burden, I would like to say welcome to each of you. Tonight, we are honored to have David Cobb with us, who is the National Projects Director of Democracy Unlimited. In my conversation prior to the meeting, prior to us starting, I was very pleased to hear that David started out his first 2 years at a community college. So he really knows what it is to be at a community college, and he truly understands the community college environment and what the community college can do for students. At the present time, David is a lawyer, political activist, and engaged citizen. He's dedicated his adult life to making the promise of a democratic republic a reality in the United States. He sued corporate polluters, lobbied elected officials, run for political office himself, and has been arrested for nonviolent civil disobedience. He truly believes that we all must use the tools in our toolbox to affect the systemic social change that we so desperately need. He was born in San Leon, Texas, and worked as a laborer before going to college. As I said, he went to San Jacinto Community College for 2 years. After that, he went on and graduated from the University of Houston Law School in 1983, and then maintained a successful law practice in Houston for several years prior to devoting himself to full-time activism to achieve real democracy in the United States. In 2002, he ran for Attorney General in Texas, pledging to use the office to revoke charters of corporations that repeatedly violate health, safety, and environmental laws. He later on, in 2004, ran for the President of the United States on the Green Party ticket and successfully campaigned for the Ohio recount. He's currently on staff at Democracy Unlimited and a spokesperson for Move to Amend. At this point, I would like to welcome Dave to the podium and say we certainly appreciate your coming to North Shore Community College to share your thoughts with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Dean. So I'm going to go right here, and first just check over here. How we doing? Good. So as the Dean said, my name is David Cobb. I like to say that I am a proud, I am a patriotic, and these days I'm a pissed off American citizen. Good. I like to get a little response like that, actually, because I think that my anger these days is a righteous anger. And I use that word very carefully because, you see, I'm the grandson of a Baptist preacher. I know exactly what the word righteous means. And the anger that I'm feeling about the country that I live in, the anger that I'm feeling around the racist, sexist, class-oppressive systems, the anger that I'm feeling about the fact that 25% of the children are going to bed hungry in the richest country in the world, the anger that I'm feeling that 1 in 6 American families are living below the poverty level, that anger really is righteous. And I also want to be clear, righteous anger is a very unique type of anger. Because, you see, if you get mad because you don't get your way, that's not righteous. Righteous anger can only be provoked by anger at injustice, oppression, unfairness. But even deeper, if you get angry at those things and you don't do anything about it, you just stew and wallow in your anger, that's not righteous either. See, righteous anger requires action. It requires that you engage to try to correct the injustice, to try to engage to make things right. And saying it that way, can't we see that it was righteous anger that helped fuel the abolitionist movement in this country? They were angry about that depraved institution. It was righteous anger that brought those women together at Seneca Falls because they were angry at a patriarchal system that was systematically and routinely oppressing them. It was righteous anger that fueled the trade union movement. Righteous anger fueled the civil rights movement. Righteous anger is a good thing. Right? We should acknowledge that. And I also want to tell you this. I also think of myself as a proud, patriotic, and sad American because, you see, I can remember a time in my life when I could just say I was a proud and patriotic American and I didn't need any other qualifier. And for me personally, that's when I was a little boy. When I was taught that I was from the United States of America and that the United States of America stood for liberty and justice and equality. And I was so proud to be from that country as a little boy. And I'll acknowledge I didn't understand and know all of the implications philosophically and morally about that, but I knew this. It meant my country was fair. It meant my country was good. It meant my country was just. And you see, I'm angry and I'm sad because I grew up to realize I had been lied to. But you know, that's a harsh word, isn't it? So instead, let's say this. I grew up to realize that I had been subjected to a creation myth. And I want to change the wording a little bit for two reasons. Number one, because it is a harsh thing to say I was lied to. I don't think that's true. And secondly, a creation myth because, you see, I actually have a name, a voice, a face that I can recall and conjure up that I most closely associate that creation myth with. And for me, that person, Mrs. Armstrong. She was my 5th grade teacher. Are there any current, future, or former public teachers in this crowd tonight? Raise your hand. There always are. Now let's give a round of applause for everybody whose hand is up. Everywhere I go, I ask for that round of applause for public teachers for two reasons. Number one, I don't think we thank public teachers enough in this country. We certainly don't pay them enough money. And the second reason I ask for a round of applause is in honor of Mrs. Armstrong. See, Mrs. Armstrong didn't go to bed at night saying, I can't wait till these children come into my classroom. I'm going to fill their mind full of lies and propaganda. And their little dog, too. No. Mrs. Armstrong was a public school teacher, and like every public school teacher I've ever met, she became a teacher because she wanted to nurture children to become productive members of society. You see, Mrs. Armstrong taught that creation myth to me, and it worked on me. And it worked on my classmates, and frankly, it worked on you, because I'm watching how you're reacting to me. You see, that creation myth works because we want to believe it. You see, we want to live in liberty, justice, and equality. In fact, I'll do you one better. We deserve it. It's our birthright. Our birthright. And I'm going to go even further and tell you this. It is definitely true that American children want and deserve liberty, justice, and equality. And it's not because they are American children. It's because they are human beings. And yes, American children want and deserve liberty, justice, and equality, and so do Iraqi children, and Afghan children, and Israeli children, and Palestinian children, and Mexican children, children all over the world. You see, what I'm challenging you to grapple with is the idea that those principles and values that I'm describing, that you were taught, that I was taught, those are not merely American values. Those are human values. And whenever we begin to think that way and begin to recognize this, I think it helps us to open our hearts and open our minds to asking, how is society writ large operating? Yes, we have a responsibility in the United States of America because this is our country. This is our nation state. Absolutely. But we also have to recognize that we are living in the most interconnected time period that human history has ever seen. As a result, we really have to take into account and consider those kinds of interconnections. And whether you like it or not, we look at the Arab Spring. We look at the global south. We look at what's happening in Latin America, and we realize how connected we are. And I'm going to go one better and tell you this. Our interconnection also underscores something very important, and that is this. I believe that we are living in a series of crises. It's not just one crisis. It's a series of interconnected crises, an ecological crisis, an economic crisis, a social justice crisis. There are a series of cascading crises that's going to require a global response. And I don't want to freak anybody out by all these crises, because I do believe that they're happening and we have to be honest about that. But I'll tell you something else. I'll remind you that in the Chinese language, the symbol for crisis is also the symbol for another concept: opportunity. This is so amazing when we think about it, because yes, there are all these crises, but it's presenting us, this generation of human beings that are living on the planet, an opportunity unlike almost any other group of human beings have ever faced. And that's an incredibly exhilarating thing to think about. And as we go about thinking about how to best turn crisis into opportunity, or avail ourselves of the opportunity, I want to tell you this. I think that we're going to have to learn to be very persuasive as we convince people that we have the capacity to make the kind of changes that they already know they want to make. Good news is we don't have to convince them that changes are necessary. Look at any polling data, and it's very clear there is a widespread disgust about how things are. Our challenge is to be persuasive that we can successfully win. And so, since we want to be persuasive, I want to share with you something that I knew intuitively as a trial lawyer, and now scientists are proving beyond a shadow of a doubt. Y'all ready? It's this. If you want to be persuasive, facts don't matter so much. Man, y'all, the first time I actually heard that, I thought, oh no, this is terrible. I mean, like many of you, I'm sure I've invested a lot of time and energy in learning facts. And we kind of think that if you just learn the facts and then learn to present them cogently and lucidly, that everybody will see what you see, and therefore we'll be able to make change. And then I had the good privilege of getting to know the work of, and then coming to know, a fella named George Lakoff. Some of you may know this man. He's a cognitive scientist at Berkeley, at the University of California at Berkeley. And as a cognitive scientist, he has actually proved how we process information. Not just liberals, not just conservatives, not just Americans, how the human brain processes information. And here's the thing. We don't just take discrete facts and apply logic and then deduce things. I mean, maybe the engineers in the group, you know, the freaks, y'all may do that, but almost all the rest of us actually understand the world through the stories we tell each other. And we begin to tell stories, we hear stories, and those stories begin to shape our worldview, our frame. It sets the frame for how we see the world. And then, whenever you or me are presented with new information, we process those new facts based on the pre-existing story that we already have about how the world works, right? And so, if you really want to be effective, you've got to understand what the frame is and then be able to communicate this new information and these new facts. And I'm also going to be very transparent with you. As I go forward, I want you to ask yourself genuinely, number one, could you see yourself telling some version of this story? And number two, is this a story that transcends politics? Is this a story that transcends political parties? Is this a story that transcends ideology? And since I am very clear that I want to be persuasive, and I know for a fact that we see the world through stories, I'm going to tell a story. I'm going to tell a story on how it came to be that large transnational corporations are not just exercising power today. I'm going to tell a story on how it came to be that large transnational corporations are ruling us. As surely as masters once ruled slaves, as surely as kings once ruled subjects, unelected and unaccountable corporate CEOs are ruling us because they're making the fundamental public policy decisions. Corporate CEOs already decided what all of our transportation choices were going to be. They've already decided what our health care options are going to be. They've already decided what what our environmental policy is going to be. They've already decided our energy policy. Corporate CEOs decided whether this country would go to war. And we, the people, are left to choose between paper or plastic. We can choose between Coke or Pepsi. We can choose from a myriad of consumer choices. And I want to be clear about this. I'm glad to have consumer choices. Don't get me wrong. Consumer choices are a good thing. But do not mistake a consumer choice with actual political power. Because real political power would be able to meaningfully participate in affecting the decisions that actually will impact you. And the reality is that we very rarely have mechanisms in this society where that kind of power is invited, where we can actually exercise it. And I want to be clear, mad props to our voter registration folks. Who is that registering voters? Let's give a round of applause for our voter registration people. And I'm challenging us to think about going beyond voting, which is not to say not to vote. It is yes, vote, and go even further as an engaged citizen. And that, I think, is something very important. The second thing I want to be clear about is, as I tell this story, there are 4 concepts that I want to make sure we cover. The first concept is the word democracy. That word gets tossed around a lot in this country. So let's make sure that we've got some common agreement here. From what language does the word democracy come? Greek. Let's break it down. Demos means the people. Kratia means, anybody know? Rule. Very good. So literally, the word democracy translated from Attic Greek means the people rule. Quick pop quiz. How many of you believe we, the people, are ruling in the United States? Don't be shy. Look around. There is one hand in the air. This is a very good turnout here, and kudos, Dean, and kudos to the North Shore Move to Men. A great turnout, one hand in the air. I want to tell you something, folks. That is a problem. But saying it another way, I think it's a good thing. It's not a good thing that we, the people, don't rule. But I think it's a good thing that fewer and fewer people are just, without thinking, just raising their hands proudly to that question, notwithstanding what Mrs. Armstrong taught. In other words, I think it's a good thing that we're finally having the courage, that we're finally having the ability to confront squarely the reality that there is a small ruling elite in this country that are actually making most of the decisions. And as hard as that is, as Americans, for us to come to terms with, I think it's a good thing, because when you actually accurately define a problem, oftentimes solutions begin to present themselves that were not available. I used to joke that the most dangerous threat to democracy in the United States is the mistaken belief that we actually practice one. But I think more and more people are actually coming to accept the reality that there is a ruling elite in this country and that it's a problem. And that brings me to the second concept, which is the word sovereignty. My friends, if I just had the word the sovereign on the board, who or what would you think of? Quick, the sovereign. King. I bet almost all of you thought that, right? The word that popped into your head was king. That's because 500 years ago, the king was the sovereign. The sovereign was the king. Those words were literally synonymous. Sovereignty means the authority to rule. And so, of course, the king had ultimate authority to rule. And where, by the way, did the king claim his sovereignty? God. You don't get more legitimate. I mean, that's a big deal, right? In fact, to really illustrate that, we're going to do a quick little exercise together. This exercise is always a lot of fun for me. You'll see, I will invite this auditorium to close your eyes and repeat after me. David Cobb is the king. Oh, this is going well. I'll continue. Because David is God's representative on earth. I lost some of you. I'm going to try one more. And therefore, we will all do anything David tells us to do without question. Okay. All right. Couldn't get you to go along with that last one. Normally, this is when I say open your eyes. But to your credit, Lynn, nobody's eyes are closed. That's good. The second thing I'll observe is that you all did what everybody always does when you realize what I was trying to get you to say. You all laughed at me. Did you notice that? There was kind of a collective, I mean, some of you snickered. Some of you chuckled. I got a few guffaws. I got a couple of harumps, right? But everybody basically kind of laughed at that. You know why? Because it's funny. And not funny as in, David has just made a very witty and droll comment. No, it wasn't that sophisticated. I used what a comedian would call absurd humor. I set you up and then said something so absurd that your only reaction could be to laugh or snicker or otherwise laugh at it. I mean, the idea that I can tell Mike how to live his life because who my parents are, or even better, that I somehow have the authority to say how all of society is going to be organized because of the divine right of kings, that's ridiculous. That is absurd. Of course you laugh at that. And 500 years ago, people like you and you and you and me, we not only said it, but we believed it. My friends, I'm asking you to take a sober moment. Really, think about it. The question of sovereignty and who has the authority to rule, or even better, what the mechanics and the processes for legitimate power and decision-making, this might be one of the most important first principles that any group of human beings asks for themselves, right? And look, I'm a Green Party member, as the Dean mentioned, and I'm proud of that. I'm equally proud to tell you I frequently work in collaboration and partnership with Democrats. I also am happy to tell you I frequently find myself working in coalition with Republicans and libertarians on my fight against the Patriot Act and other civil liberty invasions. It was very frequently libertarians and Republicans that I would be working in coalition with. I've worked with anarchists and socialists. You see, I have a long history of working in coalition with people who I may not completely agree with, but if I can find enough common ground, I'll work, right, in coalition. And I say that not so you'll pat me on the head. I say that so you'll appreciate what I mean when I say, in my 20, 25 years of efforts at social change, I've never had the privilege or the opportunity to work in coalition with a monarchist. And 500 years ago, that's all there were. And 500 years is the blink of an eye in human history. So when people tell me, oh, you can't amend the Constitution, it's too hard, I think, have you not been paying attention? Profound systemic changes have been made in world history. Profound systemic changes have been made in U.S. history when people were willing to do the work of making that change. The abolition of slavery, women getting the right to vote, the creation of the Social Security Administration, the trade union movement, the civil rights movement, all of these things that we look back on now and think obvious and inevitable. The reality is that those seemed impossible when they first began, right? Here's something now. The Texan going to get metaphysical on y'all. You ready? We are all individually participating in creating our shared collective reality. Another way to say it, if enough people think that something is true, if enough people act like it's true, it is true. My friends, we are creating our reality. So if it is true that we live in an inherently racist, sexist, and class-oppressive society, and it is true, then I suggest we should start thinking differently. I suggest we should start acting differently. I suggest that it's incumbent upon us to act like we have the sovereign power to change it. You know why we should act like that? Because we do. And therefore, it's a responsibility, I would tell you. The next concept is very closely related, and that's legal personhood. Please note that I did not write corporate personhood on the board. Instead, I want us to just really focus on legal personhood, and I will assert to you that the way I'm talking about it, it means the ability to assert rights. In this case, I mean the ability to assert rights under law. And the ability to assert rights, when I say it that way, isn't it obvious that the question of who is a legal person and who has the ability to assert rights has been one of the fundamental questions that have been grappled with in this country? Isn't that obvious? And by the way, let's just acknowledge that's not an interesting intellectual grappling, although there's lots of intellectual grappling to do around that, but it's a very real world impact, isn't it? In fact, when we talk about who has the ability to assert rights, we start talking about getting down to the brass tacks of power and how our society is operating. This matters. It is not a technicality. It is one of the important political, philosophical questions at stake. The last concept tonight, my friends, is the word corporation. Since this concept is equally important, I will ask the same question. From what language does the word corporation derive? It's from Latin. Let's break this one down. Corpus means body. And now for extra credit points, the suffix tion in Latin, it means to have or create, an inherent quality. So literally, the word corporation broken down means to have or create body. And in this sense, we mean literally physical body. That's because I was taught in law school, and by the way, are there any lawyers in the crowd besides me that would admit it? I got 2 hands, 3 hands. All right, so I will tell you, I'll ask my sisters and brothers at the bar, do y'all remember this? Because I do, being taught in day 1 of corporations class that a corporation is a legal fiction. Yes, remembering that? Making sense? Yep. So all the lawyers, or at least the ones who admitted it, all have heard that. But watch this. Even if you weren't subjected to law school, but if you've heard that a corporation is a legal fiction, even if you couldn't precisely define exactly what that means, but honestly, if you've just heard that a corporation is a legal fiction, raise your hand. Look at all those hands go up, right? So a corporation is legal fiction. Corporation is legal fiction. Corporation is a legal fiction. Many of us have heard that a corporation is a legal fiction. That begs the question, what does the word fiction mean? Make believe, not true, made up. Here's the thing. In law school, I was taught a corporation doesn't actually exist in the physical world. You know, reality. It doesn't actually exist in the way that we think of things existing. But we will pretend like this group of people and the resources and the investment and the concept and the contractual obligations, a very complex abstraction. We're going to pretend like it exists as one thing in the material world so that we can treat it a certain way under law. And remember, if enough people think that something is true, if enough people act like it's true, poof, we can create a corporation because a corporation is a construct. It is literally created by society itself coming to terms with and asserting that this is the way it's going to be. There are lots of constructs that are incredibly important, and a corporation is a construct. And the word corporation comes from Latin because the first human beings to ever create this construct that we would think of as a corporation were, in fact, the Romans. And not, by the way, it was actually the Roman Republic, not the Roman Empire. And sometimes I wish we would spend more time asking, what happens when a republic devolves into an empire? Because that might be an important conversation in the United States. Just saying. As the great Texas Canadian Bill Hicks would say, I'm just planting seeds right now. I'm just planting seeds. But here, the Romans created this idea of a corporation for a reason. For example, y'all heard the phrase, all roads lead to Rome? Right, here it is, 2,000 years later, we still say that. Check it out. That road system was conceived, built as and by a Roman corporation. Likewise, the aqueduct system, that amazing bit of engineering that moved water all across the Italian peninsula. Quick parenthetical, one of the things that gives me such optimism about what is possible is the absolute knowledge about how clever and creative human beings are. An aqueduct system without electricity? Are you kidding me? How amazing is that, right? That aqueduct system conceived of, built, designed, and operated as a corporation. Likewise, the first universities, the first hospitals, can you guess? Corporation, corporation. A quick pop quiz. What does a road system, a water system, a university, a hospital, what do they all have in common? Everything I've just described, sir, is a public good. I will tell you that I think at its essence, the genius of the idea of a corporation is to take private money, material, and resources, organize it in a voluntary manner, not mandatory, but a voluntary manner, and then put those resources to some public good. I want to be clear, David Cobb is not anti-corporation. The move to amend coalition is not anti-corporation. Corporations have historically, both throughout world history, U.S. history, even right now, there are many corporations that are doing important good things. It's a very valuable way to help facilitate work getting done and things to occur, right? So I just want to warn all of us to recognize that we should not just fall into some sort of anti-corporation language, because that is actually not helpful. It's not very sophisticated, because there is a way in which the corporation as an entity is a very important thing, and I don't really know how we could organize our society without acknowledging that importance, right? At the same time, I do feel obliged to point out this is not exactly how the modern transnational corporation operates, is it? That's because the modern transnational corporation actually has its roots and comes out of the 14th and 15th century of Europe. You know, the age of discovery. I have to put my word discovery in quotation marks, right? Because after all, what did the Europeans discover in the 14th and 15th century? Well, Africa, Asia, later North and South America. Newsflash, there were people living there. They weren't lost. In fact, they weren't discovered at all, were they? In fact, let's just be as honest and as straightforward as we were earlier and acknowledge that the so-called age of discovery is actually the age of rape and pillage and plunder and murder. There's one word that really sums it up for me. It's the age of empire. You see, that's the age of the modern empire. And actually, imperialism means beating people down. It means stealing from them. It means killing them and taking their resources. That's what imperialism means in this context. And it's brutal and it's ugly, and we ought to be very clear about this. And now, I want you to stay with me because this is important. The modern transnational corporation, as we know it, actually began as a joint stock company. That's what they were actually called. And stay with me, because the joint stock company was created intentionally and deliberately as an instrument of empire. That's what they were designed to do. One of the most famous of those joint stock companies was the East India Company, literally designed and charged and tasked with the legal responsibility to militarily crush the entire people of the subcontinent of India, and not just to crush them militarily, but to destroy their existing civilization and to destroy their existing institutions so that new institutions could be imposed upon them. New institutions that would actually require them to toil and labor at stealing the resources from their own land and sending those resources back to the shareholders of the East India Company. That was their business model. Another of those early joint stock companies was the Africa Trading Company. Anybody want to guess what the Africa Trading Company traded? You know, I heard a couple of different words there, and so I'm going to use myself as an example because I think it's important for white folks to actually have honest public conversations about race. And so I'm going to use myself as an example and acknowledge that if I'm just being casual, I'm not saying lazy, but if I'm not really thinking, you know, if I'm just sort of floating along in culture and somebody were to ask me, what did the Africa Trading Company trade? I promise the answer that pops into my head, unbidden to me, slaves. I mean, after all, I was taught from a very little boy about the African slave trade. I was even taught about how wonderful it was that runaway slaves like Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth escaped and helped other slaves run away. So that's the story that I've been told so many times that, of course, if you ask, what did the Africa Trading Company trade? The word that pops into most of our heads are slaves. But since I've made such a big deal about that, let me ask a follow-up question. In the 14th and 15th century, was Africa populated by a bunch of slaves? No. Instead, Africa was populated by people, right? People. Africa was populated by people. And now, I will tell you with some conviction or some trepidation, but also with conviction, Africa was populated by people who were basically just like me. Now, I say that with the trepidation because I know I'm a white person. I know what my pigment is. I'm not stupid. But I say it with conviction because if you ask any scientist, if you ask any biologist, she or he will tell you race does not exist. Obviously, skin color exists, pigment exists, but no scientist would ever elevate something so trivial as that to a taxonomy or a classification amongst human beings. So race does not exist, but check this out. Racism damn sure does. How can that possibly be? Oh yes, if enough people think that something is true, if enough people act like it's true, poof! We create race as a construct. It is created as a construct, and just as the corporation was created as a construct for a reason, race got created as a construct for a reason, and that was to justify the depraved, idiotic, disgusting idea of enslaving human beings. And we ought to own that and acknowledge that, because I'm not the first American to actually say that and to point out the connections, because I'm telling you that there is a connection between racism, imperialism, and corporatism. And a very famous American basically said that as well in his best political speech. It's not this American's most famous speech. His most famous speech is, "I have a dream." Who am I talking about? Of course, I'm talking about the Reverend Martin Luther King. And "I have a dream" is a beautiful speech. It's like a psalm. It's epic. It's wonderful, right? But honestly, folks, that's not his best political analysis as a speech. For my money, King's best political speech wasn't delivered in Washington, D.C. It was delivered in Harlem. Specifically, it was delivered at the Riverside Church. I see some of you know this speech. It's also known as Beyond War or Beyond Vietnam. And in that speech, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. said, "The United States of America is suffering from a spiritual and moral decay." It's a strong word for a reverend. A spiritual and moral decay that he says is a result of the triple evils of racism, militarism, and extreme materialism, or just greed. And King said those are interconnected, and unless and until we slice that Gordian knot and get past it, we can't become the country that we deserve. King said we can't create the country that we want. King said we can't create the country that God intends unless and until we address the interconnected nature of exploitation and oppression. And let me tell you something, folks. King was right. He was right then, and he's right now. And what is both inspiring and maddening and all of that rolled into one is that new world is right at our fingertips. We have the capacity to literally start to recreate the world, and we're not doing it, or at least not enough of us are doing it. And what I'm suggesting to you is part of my challenge to you is to start thinking about how we might engage ourselves in that great work of actually making a functioning democratic republic a reality in the United States that is not based upon exploitation, oppression, and racism. And I think that we have the capacity to do it. And since I've finally gotten around to America in my story, remember this is a story. Here's a question. In the founding of what became the United States of America, how many original colonies? Come on, y'all, we're in Massachusetts. This is an easy one. How many? 13. That's a gimme. So here's the real question. Of those 13 colonies, how many of them were corporations? Oh, nicely done. It was a trick question, but many of you saw right through it. The answer, all of them. All of them in this sense. The word corporation means to have or create body, and I'm telling you that the king created each one of them. The king created Massachusetts. Now, somebody in the crowd might be thinking, that's ridiculous. Massachusetts was already here. That's why it's a trick question. The land was here. The people who lived on the land, the rivers and the streams and the fish and the forest and the deer, you know, physical reality, that was there. But it took the king to create Massachusetts. And the king created Massachusetts by the use of a very specific legal instrument. Anybody know what that instrument is called? Nicely done. It's called a charter. And I'm going to now do another exercise to illustrate just how exactly the king created Massachusetts by a charter. In this exercise, I'll be the king. Why do y'all think I might be the king in this little exercise? Because I'm telling the story, right? See how important stories are? See how important it is that we ask who's telling us these stories? I think that if we actually spent just a little more time examining our media and where it's coming from and what stories they're telling, it might be helpful. So in this little exercise, though, I'll be the king, and with nothing more than a writing instrument, a piece of paper, and my political power, I will create Massachusetts. But of course, I'm not going to bother with the day-to-day affairs of administering Massachusetts. After all, I'm the king. I've got other people to rape and pillage and plunder, which apparently are kingly duties at this time period, because that's what's going on. But now I will create Massachusetts, but will assign a royal governor. Mike, I'm going to make you a governor. How about that? So I will create Massachusetts, but I will assign a royal governor. And now, my friends, I'm going to quote from the actual original charter that created Massachusetts. Watch this. I, the king, create Massachusetts. Political boundaries are described. I assign a royal governor and task the royal governor with the legal duty and responsibility, quote, to plant, to rule, and to govern this new area to benefit me, the king, and to benefit the other shareholders of the joint stock company known as the Massachusetts Bay Trading Company. Massachusetts began as a for-profit corporation on the same exact business model as the East India Company. So too was Virginia, the Virginia Company. Rhode Island was the Rhode Island and Providence Plantation. Georgia was a penal corporation. Do you know what skin color, by the way, most of the original slaves had in Georgia? White. You know, this is only to the white people in the crowd right now. We would do well to actually try to come to understand the creation of whiteness and why that happened. Because listen, ethnicity is real. Like where you come from, like the culture and the history. Like, you know, if you're white and it's actually Scottish or English or you know, European, you know, some northern Western European, like those are all real. Whiteness was created. And let me now share with you how I think, as somebody who grew up in poverty, I think I've actually got a handle on it. It goes like this. Man, the boss man's got his boot on our neck. This is terrible. I hate this. At least I'm white. Folks, whiteness is created as a construct to bamboozle white people, specifically working class white people, right? I mean, I think it's very important that we actually be willing to actually have these kinds of conversations. But the point I'm making here around the creation of whiteness as a construct is also to tie it back to the creation of Massachusetts as a colonial construct, right? And as we all know, the American revolutionaries were not calling for a more socially responsible king. Perhaps we should do more than just ask for more socially responsible corporations or more socially responsible ruling elites. Maybe we should raise our aspirations a little higher. And because another thing I want to say, the American Revolution, like here we are, just like this is like, I hope it's not offensive, but for me coming from Texas, this pretty much is Boston, right? Like more or less, right? So let's just acknowledge that in that harbor, a couple of 100 years ago, there was a little thing called the Boston Tea Party. Let me ask y'all, did those patriots throw all the tea in the harbor that night? No. The Boston Patriots targeted one specific tea, one specific corporation's tea. Y'all know what it was? The East India Company is the only tea that was thrown overboard that night. I want to be clear about this. The Boston Tea Party was an exercise of nonviolent civil disobedience targeting a very specific multinational corporation that was oppressing. I sometimes wish that current so-called Tea Party patriots would dig a little bit further and actually come to understand what it is that they're actually emulating. Because, you know, hey, if said properly, I'm right there. I think that's very important. And here's the other thing. I told you that the American revolutionaries weren't calling for a more socially responsible king. That's true, but let me tell you this. 10 years before the revolution erupted, those same people, most of them were writing letters to the king that went something like this. "O Father King, we, your humble children, come before you on bended knee to ask, Will you please intervene on our behalf? Your royal governor is administering unfair laws, unfair business and trade laws. The big complaint wasn't actually taxation without representation. That was part of it. But the big beef were the impact of these laws are unjust and unfair. Laws being written by the English Parliament, King, are unfairly oppressing us and unfairly benefiting the East India Company. Quick pop quiz. What percentage of the English Parliament writing those laws actually owned shares in the East India Company? 100%. I wonder if that's related. Oh, Father King, will you please intervene on our behalf? Your humble children beseech you. It was the most sniveling, groveling language you can imagine. And I don't know about you, but I am keenly interested in trying to understand what stories did they start to tell each other. What was going on in their heads? What was it culturally that convinced them to stop the boot kissing, to stop the begging and the pleading, and instead to stand up? Get up off their knees and to stand up straight and proud, put their shoulders back, their chin up, look directly at the king. You know, the king who claimed cultural authority from God at this point. And to see behind the king the most powerful military the world had ever assembled and said, "You're done, get out, we're going to do it different now." Because let me tell you something, folks, that process I just described, that is magic. And I want to be clear about something. If just one person stands up against oppression and injustice, that's courageous, and it deserves our gratitude, our respect, our admiration, but that's not magic. You see, the magic can only be invoked when one person stands up against injustice and oppression, and somebody to her left stands up, and somebody to her right stands up, and you have this collective standing up and welling up. That's when the magic is invoked. And at this point, can I say, may the goddess bless the Occupy movement. Yeah, you can applaud that. I think there was something magic about Occupy. I think there's still something magic about Occupy, because I just came back from New York City for the one-year anniversary, and let me tell you, the kids are all right. The thing about the Occupy movement that is so magical, I think, is this. They were not just challenging us or inviting us or daring us to occupy public space. The Occupy movement at its core challenged us to occupy imagination space, to imagine that we could actually live in a different society, that we don't have to be engaged in exploitation and oppression, that we don't have to give up all of our power to a 1% who are going to make all the decisions and to have us hurtling over a cliff, right? I mean, the Occupy movement is an amazing thing, and I think that that's really worth acknowledging even as we think about what to do. But I want to get back to my story because I've got you right on the verge of the American Revolution. And if any of you are worried or wondering, the revolutionaries won. Yay! So a new charter gets written. A new charter, a new legal instrument to describe the supreme law of the land, to describe the political, legal framework for how our government will operate. What's that charter called? The U.S. Constitution. How many people here have read the Constitution? Be honest. All right. I'm looking at the student over here with your professor right next to you. I hope you raised your hand. All right. The U.S. Constitution. Folks, when you read this document in its entirety, I will tell you, not just the individual words, but read the whole thing with an eye towards systems and patterns. Like my mama said, son, step back from the fabric. Look at the whole thing. Anytime you start to try to think in terms of systems and processes, you will have a better understanding about how things work. When you look at the Constitution in that framework, I'll tell you, you'll see two principal actors at play. The first actor is the most important actor. In fact, it's so important, it's the first three words. All I ever have to do is say, put my hand to my ear, and folks say in unison, we the people. That's because these are hallowed words in this country, and they should be. You see, we the people come together to form the second actor, which is government itself. Folks, part of what I'm trying to get us to recognize, government is also a construct. We create it. Another way to say it is, not only do we the people create government, government does not actually pre-exist us. Government is ours. We are the government in this system, and in fact, we have the constitutional revolutionary right to alter or abolish it in any way that we see fit. That's actually directly out of the founding principles of the United States of America. We, the people, create government. In this document, we, the people, are described as being free and sovereign. What does the word sovereign mean again? The authority to rule. The king is not sovereign anymore. We kicked his butt out. But check this out. Government isn't sovereign either. Government in this framework is subordinate and accountable. Government is subordinate to whom? The people. Government is accountable to whom? The people. That's got a ring to it, doesn't it? I like how this is going. Let's continue. We the people are free and sovereign because we the people have rights. Government does not have rights. Government only has duties. As a lawyer, let me just stop for a moment and be very explicit here. The difference between rights and duties is profound. If I have the right to do something, it means I can do it. And I don't need government's permission. I don't need the city council's permission. I don't need the Massachusetts state legislature's permission. I don't need Congress's permission. Man, I'm from Texas. I don't need my mama's permission. Well, not legally. I mean, culturally, that might be a whole different matter, but legally, I don't need anybody's permission to exercise rights. And get this, if any action of government, local, state, or federal, infringes upon my inherent inalienable rights, government's wrong, not me. Doesn't matter what the process is, if some law infringes upon my rights, I should be able to go into court and argue that that law is illegitimate. We the people have rights over government. Government never has rights over the people. Government only has duties. And where do these governmental duties come from? Well, remember, all power resides with the people. All legitimate power is exercised only through the consent of the governed. The people have all the political power in any political jurisdiction in which you reside. Whether it's a nation state, then nationally all the power is with the people. If it's a commonwealth, then all the people of the commonwealth hold the legitimate power. If you're in a city, all the political power is held in that municipality by the people who live there. So quick pop quiz, what is the population, more or less, of Lynn, Massachusetts? 90,000 more or less. Okay, so I will celebrate that 90,000 folks in Lynn, Massachusetts hold all the political power. That's a wonderful thing. That's a fantastic thing. I will celebrate that. But I'll tell you this, I don't want to go to a meeting of 90,000 people where we decide where to put stop signs. And I like political meetings. I'm not going to that one. Point is this, folks. Yes, the people hold all the political power. But we, in this framework, delegate a certain amount of our power to government. Do we delegate all our power to government? No. We only delegate enough power to government to perform the duties that we have already told them to do. This is what is meant by the concept of limited government. I'm sure many of you have heard that phrase. Maybe some of you talk about it. If you go to my Thanksgiving dinners, you'll hear about it all the time. That's what limited government means, and I actually think that this is a good idea. And how does government discharge their duties? Because duties are responsibilities. They have a legal duty, a legal responsibility. How does government discharge those duties? By writing laws that are in the public interest. My friends, I want to stop for a moment and acknowledge that there's going to be real debate on what those laws should be. And that's as it should be. That's a good thing. But now I want to just stop for just a moment and say, I feel very young to play the I remember when game. But I remember when we could have real political debate and still be civil and respectful to one another. I think yeah, you can applaud that. Folks, I don't know what your ideology is or what your party affiliation is, but I'll tell you this. I think that we've lost something very precious in this country by not. I think you can tell I'm passionate about my politics, right? I live my politics every day. It's serious to me, and I'm passionate about it. But I'll tell you this, I also strive very hard to be civil about it. And civil in terms of respectful and gracious to people who hold different opinions. I think we've lost something by losing that kind of culture. So my challenge to you is, even as we're laying all this out, is to learn and challenge yourself to really be respectful and listen to other people and look for common ground. Because when you look for common ground, you're likely to find it. So I think that's important. But there is going to be debate over the public laws. But remember this. No public law can ever violate the private rights of an individual citizen. Remember? Oh, God, wait a minute, y'all. Mrs. Armstrong might have been right after all. Watch me sum up in 90 seconds, in I hope a concise and coherent way, how our constitutional framework and our political and legal system is supposed to operate. Here we go. In our framework, we people are free and sovereign. We hold all the political power. However, we delegate a certain amount of our power to government. Government that we will hold subordinate and accountable to the will of the people. We will charge and task government with the duty to write laws in the public interest. But the one thing that no public law can ever do is to violate the private rights of the free and sovereign citizens of that jurisdiction. Isn't that amazing? Right? Isn't that brilliant? Isn't that beautiful? We should try that in this country. This would work. And I'm not even joking. This is beautiful. And I'm not joking that this is brilliant. And I'm also joking that I don't think we've ever actually really tried it. Because before I go 1 second further waxing poetic about the U.S. Constitution, I have to get a quick time out to ask, somebody tell me what year the U.S. Constitution gets drafted in secret convention, which is an interesting thing in and of itself, or the year that the Constitution actually gets implemented and ratified and becomes the supreme law of the land. Either date. Nicely done. So 1787 was the Constitutional Convention, and 1789 is the actual ratification date. That's the date that the Constitution gets ratified and becomes the supreme law of the land, which is the reason I'm going to put that date on the board, because that's the activation date. Now I want to ask this. Now that we know that legal personhood means the ability to assert rights, who gets to be a legal person in 1789? White men. Is it all the white men? Only the property-owning white men. Saying it another way, my friends, if you're not rich, if you're not white, and if you're not a man, you're not fully a legal person. Anybody know what percentage of the adult human beings living in those 13 states, formerly colonies, but now states in 1789, was fully a person who could exercise all of the rights? 10%? 15%? Say it louder, ma'am. 5%. That's a low number, isn't it? Saying it another way, 95% of the human beings were not fully persons. I like to think of it the way the late, great Howard Zinn said it, and may the goddess rest his soul. Howard Zinn said, probably the most important, easy way to think about the entire arc of U.S. history is as a series of struggles by actual human beings to be defined as persons with rights acknowledged and protected by our Constitution. That's so important. I'm going to say it again because I think it really does sum it up. One of the easiest ways to think about the entire arc of U.S. history is as a series of struggles by actual human beings to be defined as persons with rights protected by our Constitution. Now, somebody might say, all right, Cobb, you got a scathing indictment of imperialism, but hey, we got rid of slavery. Women can vote. It's all good now. To which I say, au contraire, mon frère. It's not all good now. And a big part of the reason it's not all good is the operation of the most dominant institution on planet Earth today. The most dominant institution in U.S. politics, the most dominant institution in U.S. culture. What's that called? A corporation. I think the modern transnational corporation is a dominant institutional force. And so, if this is helpful to think about how our framework is supposed to operate, is that helpful? Does that make sense? Right? So it might behoove us to ask, where should a corporation go? Well, before I do that, I'm going to ask really quickly, anybody know what it takes to form a corporation in the Massachusetts Commonwealth today? Yeah, it's a very small filing fee, and that piece of paper, which you can actually download off of the internet now, it's actually quite easy to do as long as you're paying attention, dot your I's, cross your T's, and your little filing fee, the check clears. You know what the Secretary of State will do? Rubber stamp that paper, send it back, and have created what? A corporation. They've issued you a charter. They've created it. You know how long your corporate charter can last in Massachusetts? Forever. You know what you can do with a corporate charter under Massachusetts law? Watch this. Any legally permissible thing, all lawful activities. That's what the Massachusetts Corporation Code says today. I observed that apparently if you have enough money and wealth and influence, you can do illegal things. But the point is that we don't really even think about this doctrine or this construct as the corporation. Like, we just accept it as if it's inevitable, and the way it's operating is supposed to be inevitable. But now, my friends, I'm going to take you back to 1789 and tell you what it once took to form a corporation in Massachusetts and in every other state and in additional states, because I'm describing to you what it took to form a corporation for roughly the next 50 to 75 years in this country. First, you had to get a bill introduced in the lower house of your state government, and that was debated, and then it had to pass by a majority. But you're still not through, because now your paperwork has to go to the state senate, and it's debated, and it has to pass by a majority. But you're still not through, because now your paperwork goes to the governor, and the governor has to be willing to sign it. Does that sound like a corporate charter today? Of course not. What did I just describe? How a bill becomes a law, right? I've described the legislative process. Point I'm making, there was a time in this country that the privilege of limited liability, which is a big deal, was very tightly politically controlled. It was understood it's a privilege, not a right. And get this, that's just the mechanics of it. As you made your application, you had to prove a public need that was not being met by existing businesses that did not have the privilege of limited liability. And if you were granted the privilege of limited liability, all you could do was that specific type of business. And if you did any other type of business, you know what happened to your corporate charter? Revoked. It was revoked for what's known in Latin as ultra vires, or beyond the authority. You're going beyond the authority of what we had allowed you to do. Oh, and by the way, if you were granted your corporate charter, do you think it lasted forever? Oh, no. Listen to this. Most corporate charters were either 5, 10, at most 20 years. Every corporate charter had a specific time period at which point the limited liability dissolved. The business could continue, but if you wanted the privilege of limited liability, you had to apply all over again and prove that you deserved it. So, get this. Even if you were in the narrow time period of how long the corporate charter could last, even if you were doing the specific thing that you had been granted your corporate charter to do, if you ever did anything against the public interest, do you know what happened to your corporate charter? Revoked. Corporate charters were routinely revoked for simply acting contrary to the public interest. So here's a question. Are there any of the huge transnational corporations that could still exist today with those rules in place? In their current way? No. Now, sure, we could all spend the rest of the day talking about all the small and mid-sized corporations. Maybe you could even think of a big corporation that doesn't actually oppress and abuse and so forth. But I'm telling you this is our history. This is not just David Cobb wishful thinking. This is actually our history. It's mostly a hidden history, but it is our history. And so, now that we know that it takes an action of state government to create the corporate charter, we know that the corporate charter can be used to hold the corporation subordinate and accountable. We know that the corporate charter describes the duties of what a corporation can do. We understand that a corporation should only be allowed to exist if it's serving the public interest, or at least not harming the public interest, since we've allowed it to come into existence. Isn't it just painfully obvious that a corporation should be here under the appropriate control of the political democratic process? And here we go, folks. Thank you so much for your patience, because here comes the punchline. When the United States Supreme Court, when 5 members of the United States Supreme Court come waltzing in to tell us, by the way, in an act of supreme judicial activism, says even though the word corporation is never mentioned in the U.S. Constitution, 5 of us are going to tell 300 million of you that you have to treat a corporation, even though it was created through this political process, you have to treat it as if it's a person with inherent inalienable rights under our Constitution. And it perverts this whole framework. See, corporate personhood, or corporations having constitutional rights, is not just an illogical idea, which it is. Corporate personhood, or corporations having constitutional rights, is not just a stupid idea, which it is. But corporate personhood, or corporations having constitutional rights, steals our sacred right to self-government. It is fundamentally illegitimate. And what angers me about that is not only have they stolen our right to decide how to conduct ourselves and how to protect the environment and how to protect the public health and safety and how to protect the integrity of elections. What? We are not even allowed to do that, but what really gets my goat, they use the legal system to legitimize the theft. And they tell us, if you even want to react to this, here's the narrow way that you can actually do it. It reminds me of free speech and the new creation of free speech zones. Any of you ever seen any of these or been forced into them? A free speech zone goes like this. Here's where it really matters. So over here is your free speech zone. Come with me. Come on. Come on. Here's your free speech zone. Because over there is where the real action is. Let me tell you something, folks. As a lawyer, here's some free legal advice. I hope you'll take it from me. I believe that my free speech zone is wherever I happen to be standing. And I think that if we started to think like that, if we started to act like that, we would have a hell of a lot more power in this country, and changes could happen even more quickly. So here's the thing, folks. There is, I'm glad to tell you, a movement coalescing around this. That movement, I think, is best represented by a multiracial coalition of groups and individuals from across the country called Move to Amend. That grouping is demanding 2 things that are concrete. 1, a constitutional amendment to abolish in its entirety the idea that a corporation or any other artificial entity has constitutional rights. Another way to think about this demand is only living, breathing human beings have constitutional rights. Another way to think about this demand is the well, duh demand. Corporations, whether they're good or bad, whether you like them or not, they are artificial entity. They have legal privileges. They do not have constitutional rights. That's key. The second demand is to overturn the equally odious, also court-created idea that money equals speech. Specifically, that money equals political speech. This idea, my friends, was only created in 1976. Go and take a look at the timeline. Buckley versus Vallejo. It's a new phenomenon. Before that, do you know that in most states, it was a felony to use corporate money to even influence an election, including in Massachusetts. A felony to use corporate money and corporate treasury dollars to even influence an election. Today, the Supreme Court tells us that corporate dollars can be spent in unlimited ways and you can't regulate it at all. It's an amazing what has happened here, right? So Move to Amend has a simple, concrete demand, and I want to end with this. These demands are not issues. These are about the principles of how the democratic republic should operate. Because I'll remind you, whenever I first began, I told you I was going to tell a story. And I asked you to think about, could this story basically be told regardless of ideology or party affiliation? I'm going to conclude and tell you this. I've given this story at Occupy encampments. I've given it at universities and colleges like this. I've given it at Tea Party groups. And the only difference, I still get laughs, I still get applause at every one of those groups. The only difference, the laughs and the applause comes at different places. right? You didn't bat an eye when I said limited government or sovereignty, did you? Right? I mean, you weren't disrespectful. You didn't throw things at me, but you didn't clap either. I got applause at other places. The point I'm making is this, and I want to now open it up for some discussion, but I really want to remind you, I think that what I've just told is the best version of the American creation myth. The best principles and values of what our democratic republic is supposed to be, and throughout our history, we've gotten closer to it. And each time it's because ordinary people like you got involved. And I don't mean just voting. Absolutely vote, yes. But I mean they got involved. And they began the hard work of engaging their neighbors and their families and their friends in the kind of conversations. They began to get involved. And today, Move to Amend did not even exist 2 years ago. Today, we have over 250,000 people involved. And I'm not through. Yeah, you can applaud that, right? And we have several hundred very active organizations, over 1,000 endorsing organizations, but several hundred that are actually putting effort and work into it. And get this, we didn't even exist 2 years ago. There are now over 150 local affiliates, like the North Shore Move to Amend affiliate. And we've helped to pass 250 local resolutions that are calling for a constitutional amendment. We've put it on the ballot in 7 jurisdictions, including in jurisdictions dominated by Republicans. And every time we put it on the ballot, we win by supermajorities. And I mean it. West Allis, Wisconsin, where Republicans outnumber Greens and Democrats by a 6-4 margin. We put it on the ballot during the presidential primary process when you had a huge turnout amongst Republicans. We won that campaign by 74% of the vote. This movement is uniting people across party lines, across ideological lines. This is reminding us about what the best instincts of the democratic republic should be. So what I'm going to do at this point now is to invite you into this movement. Listen, we're running out of time. I see the hands coming up. I'll stick around so that we can have some one-on-one with you. I want to thank very much North Shore Community College for giving me the opportunity to speak. I want to thank North Shore Move to Amend for helping to organize this. And I want to thank you for coming out and staying 2 hours. Let's go.